The HOA president stood at my gate holding bolt cutters. "This gate blocks community access. Open it now or I'm cutting the lock." 6 residents stood behind him. I'd seen them driving through my private driveway for months without permission. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Richard raised the bolt cutters toward the lock. "Your property is part of Riverside Commons. Remove this gate or I remove it for you." What Richard didn't know was that his neighborhood's only entrance road crossed 200 feet of my land. No easement, no legal right. Every one of those 65 homes accessed through my property every single day. He thought a title and a folder full of HOA bylaws gave him authority over land he'd never owned. Thought threatening me with bolt cutters at my own gate would work. He was wrong. By the time I installed the second gate and landlocked his entire neighborhood, it was too late to undo what came next. Before we dive in, drop where you're listening from today, and remember to like and subscribe for more stories just like this. The HOA president was standing at my gate with bolt cutters. "This gate is blocking community access," he said. "Open it now or I'm cutting the lock." I walked down my driveway toward him. 6 other people stood behind him. HOA residents I'd seen driving through my property without permission for months. "This is private property," I said. "You're trespassing." "Your property is part of Riverside Commons," he said, holding up a folder. "This gate violates community access rules. You're required to maintain open access." "I'm not in your HOA." "That's not how this works," he smiled. The kind of smile people use when they think they've already won. "Remove the gate, or I'm removing it for you." "Get off my property." He raised the bolt cutters toward the lock. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I have someone on my property threatening to destroy my gate with bolt cutters. I need a sheriff's deputy." He lowered the cutters but didn't leave. He was still standing there, arms crossed, when the deputy arrived 15 minutes later. Let me explain how it got to this point. I bought the 3-acre wooded lot 2 years ago. It was exactly what I wanted. Secluded, quiet, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. No neighbors visible through the trees, no HOA meetings, no architectural review boards telling me what color I could paint my mailbox. The property had a 400-foot private driveway from the main road to the house, winding through the forest. And I installed a gate at the entrance for privacy and security. It was my driveway, my property, my choice. On 3 sides, I had nothing but forest. On the 4th side, about a quarter mile through the woods, was Riverside Commons, a gated HOA community built 5 years ago. 65 homes with matching mailboxes, identical landscaping, and strict architectural guidelines. I deliberately bought property outside the HOA. I'd looked at homes inside Riverside Commons and decided I wanted no part of it. Monthly dues, board meetings, rules about where you could park your car, none of it appealed to me. For the first 6 months after I moved in, everything was perfect. Exactly the peace and quiet I'd wanted. Then the HOA residents discovered my driveway. It started with 1 car driving through, then 2, then 5. Well, my driveway connected to the main road about half a mile from the Riverside Commons entrance. For residents heading north, cutting through my property saved them 2 minutes compared to using their own HOA entrance. 2 minutes. That's all it was worth to them. At first, I didn't mind. A few cars a day didn't bother me. I figured people had gotten lost or were avoiding traffic on the main road, but it didn't stay at a few cars. Within 3 months, I was seeing 30 to 40 cars a day. Morning commuters racing through at 7 a.m. Afternoon school runs with parents stopping to chat in my driveway while waiting for the bus. Evening traffic heading home from work. They drove fast, 30, 40 miles per hour on a narrow gravel driveway designed for 15. Rocks kicked up by their tires cracked my windshield twice. When they threw trash out their windows, coffee cups, fast food bags, water bottles scattered along my driveway. One morning, I found 3 cars parked on my grass, blocking my own access to my house. The drivers were standing around talking, waiting for the school bus. When I asked them to move, one woman looked annoyed. "We're just waiting for the bus," she said. "On my property," I said, "without permission." "It's a shortcut. Everyone uses it." I installed signs. "Private driveway, no through traffic." They ignored them. I stood at the entrance one morning and tried to wave cars away. A woman in a black SUV rolled down her window. "Excuse me, you can't." I started. "We have a right to use this road," she interrupted. "It's community access." "This is my private property." "Talk to the HOA, she said, and drove past me, kicking up gravel. And that afternoon, I called a fence company and ordered a gate. The gate went up on a Saturday morning. Solid steel, 7 feet tall, with a keypad lock. By Sunday evening, my phone was ringing. "This is Richard Chen, HOA president of Riverside Commons. I'm calling about the gate you installed blocking community access." "It's not blocking community access," I said. "It's blocking access to my private property. Your driveway has been used by our residents for years as an alternative route." 2 years. I've owned this property for 2 years, and it's not an alternative route. It's my driveway. Regardless of technicalities, we need that access maintained for our community. I'm asking you to remove the gate." "I'm not removing it." "Then we'll have no choice but to take formal action." He hung up. 3 days later, CIS's certified letter arrived. Notice of violation. Unauthorized gate installation blocking community access easement. Remove gate within 30 days or face fines of $500 per day and potential legal action. I read it 3 times. Community access easement? I'd never signed anything granting an easement. I'd never even been contacted by the HOA before buying the property. I threw the letter in my desk drawer and ignored it. Richard showed up 4 weeks later. He brought 6 people with him, HOA residents, including the woman in the black SUV, who told me to talk to the HOA. "You ignored our notice," Richard said, standing at my closed gate. "The gate needs to come down today." "No." He pulled a thick document from his folder. "This is the Riverside Commons Master Plan, filed with the county when the development was approved in 2019. Not all properties within the described boundary are subject to community access easements for traffic flow and emergency services." "I never signed that." "You didn't have to. The master plan was approved by the county as part of the development permit. Your property falls within the designated access boundary." He turned the document around and showed me a map with a large area outlined in red. My property appeared to be inside it. "See? You're in the zone. My deed doesn't mention any easement. The master plan supersedes individual deeds. When the county approved the access provisions, they became binding on all properties in the area." He closed the folder. "I'm a former city councilman. I know how this works. You can't just block community access because you feel like it. This is my private driveway, and it's subject to community access provisions. You're also blocking emergency access, which is a public safety violation." He gestured to the people behind him. "These are your neighbors. They need this access. Open the gate. Get off my property. We're not leaving until you remove this gate." I went inside and called a property attorney. Marcus Webb reviewed my deed, my title insurance, and the HOA's master plan document that Richard had shown me. "Your deed is completely clear," Marcus said. 3 acres, fee simple ownership, no HOA membership, no easements, no restrictions. You bought the property free and clear. What about their master plan? It's worthless as applied to you. And they can't unilaterally create an easement over your property just by filing a development plan with the county. Easements require the property owner's explicit consent or a recorded legal document. You never consented and there's no recorded easement. So the gate stays. The gate stays, but based on what you've told me about Richard, he's not going to accept that answer." Marcus was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more threatening letters. Richard showed up twice more with different groups of angry residents, each time demanding I remove the gate immediately. One letter threatened HOA fines of $500 per day, despite the fact that I wasn't in the HOA and had never paid them $1 in dues. Then, at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, my phone rang from an unknown number. "You think you can block our access?" a man's voice said. "That gate's coming down one way or another." He hung up before I could respond. The next morning, I installed security cameras at the gate and along the driveway. Then I started researching Riverside Commons. I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with, how the HOA was formed, what the original development looked like, how they'd gotten so convinced they had rights to my property. I pulled the development plans from county records. Riverside Commons was built 5 years ago by a company called Horizon Properties. They'd purchased a large parcel of land, subdivided it into 65 residential lots, and formed an HOA. The development had one entrance, a main road called Commons Drive that ran from the public highway to the neighborhood. I traced Commons Drive on the subdivision map. I'm following it from where it left the highway to where it entered the Riverside Commons development. Then I pulled my own property survey and overlaid it on the county map. My hands stopped moving. Commons Drive, the only road into Riverside Commons, the road that all 65 HOA residents used every single day to access their homes, crossed 200 feet of my property before reaching HOA land. I stared at the maps for 10 minutes, checking and rechecking the property lines. There was no mistake. The developer had built the entrance road to Riverside Commons across land they didn't own, my land, and they'd apparently done it without recording an easement or obtaining any legal right-of-way. I checked every recorded document related to the property. Deeds, easements, rights-of-way, utility agreements. Nothing. No easement granting Riverside Commons access across my property. I called Marcus. They don't just use my driveway as a shortcut, I said. Their main entrance road runs through my property. 200 feet of Commons Drive crosses my land before it reaches the HOA. How is that possible? The developer must have had an informal agreement with the previous owner, but it was never recorded. When I bought the property, no easement transferred. So every resident of Riverside Commons is trespassing across your property? Every single one. Every time they come home. Every time they leave for work. Every time they drive anywhere. Silence on the line while Marcus processed this. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. I thought about Richard standing at my gate with bolt cutters. I thought about his smug smile when he told me the master plan supersedes individual deeds. I thought about the threatening phone call in the middle of the night. If Richard wants to force open my gate, I said, I'll gate his entire neighborhood. The lien arrived by certified mail 6 days after my conversation with Marcus. Notice of lien. Property located at address is hereby assessed a fine of $5,000 for blocking community access in violation of Riverside Commons access provisions. Fine will escalate by $500 per day until violation is corrected. I called Marcus immediately. They filed a lien against my property. For what? Blocking community access. $5,000 escalating $500 per day. That lien is completely invalid. Your property predates their HOA and you never agreed to any access provisions. I'll file a motion to remove it, but this tells me they're not backing down. Neither am I. Then we need to establish exactly what you own. I'm recommending you hire a surveyor to map your property boundaries down to the inch. If we're going to fight this, we need documentation that's unassailable in court. The surveyor arrived 3 days later. He spent 2 full days marking boundaries, taking measurements, and comparing the results against county records and my deed. When he handed me the final survey report, he pointed to a section of the map. "This is interesting," he said. "See this road here? Commons Drive, the main entrance to Riverside Commons? What about it? 200 feet of it crosses your property, right here." He traced his finger along the map. "From where it leaves the public highway to where it reaches the HOA's land, it's entirely on your property. There's no recorded easement in the county records. So every car that drives into that neighborhood crosses my land? Every single one. Has been for 5 years, apparently." I paid the surveyor and took the report directly to Marcus's office. Marcus reviewed the survey for 20 minutes, cross-referencing it against county maps and recorded easements. Then he looked up at me. "They have no legal right to use that road. The developer, a company called Horizon Properties, apparently had an informal agreement with the previous owner, but it was never formalized into a recorded easement. When Horizon went bankrupt 4 years ago, that informal agreement died with them. When you bought the property 2 years ago, no easement transferred because none existed. What about their claim of prescriptive easement? Richard said they've been using it for 5 years. Prescriptive easement requires continuous use for a specific period, usually 10 to 20 years depending on the state, and it doesn't apply against a new owner who hasn't given permission. You've owned the property for 2 years. They'd need to establish prescriptive rights against you specifically, which they can't do because you just installed a gate blocking access. So what happens now? Now they have a problem. That's the only road into their development. The alternative routes require an 8-mile detour on unpaved county roads. If you gate that 200-foot section, their entire neighborhood is landlocked. I drove out to Riverside Commons that afternoon and parked near the entrance. I watched car after car drive down Commons Drive across my property into the neighborhood. Commuters coming home from work, parents picking up kids from school, delivery trucks, mail carriers, all of them trespassing. My phone rang the next morning. It was Marcus. They filed a lawsuit, he said. Just got served with the complaint. What are they asking for? Everything. They want you to remove your gate. They want the court to grant them a permanent easement across your driveway. They want a court-ordered easement across the 200-foot section of Commons Drive. And they want you to pay their legal fees. On what grounds? Blocking emergency access, creating a public safety hazard, and interfering with established community infrastructure. It's a stretch, but they're clearly hoping a judge will side with 65 families over one property owner. What do we do? I'll file a response, but I also think we should make them an offer. Show the court you're willing to be reasonable. Marcus sent a letter that afternoon. My client is willing to discuss granting an easement across the disputed section of Commons Drive. In exchange, the HOA must pay fair market value for the easement, $200,000, and remove all fines and liens against my client's property. Richard's response came back within hours, not through his attorney, but directly to me via email. We've been using that road for 5 years. We're not paying you $200,000 for access we already have. You drop your gate demands or we'll see you in court. I forwarded the email to Marcus. I guess we're going to court. Looks that way. I went to bed that night at 11. At 1:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the security camera at my gate. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone. 3 people were standing at my gate with bolt cutters and a crowbar. Even in the grainy night vision footage, I recognized Richard. The other 2 were HOA board members I'd seen at previous confrontations. I watched as Richard cut through the lock. They pushed the gate open and propped it with a large rock so it couldn't close. Then they got back in their car and drove away. 20 minutes later, the HOA's Facebook page had a new post. Gate removed, community access restored. May thank you to everyone who stood up for our rights. I called the sheriff's department and filed a report. Then I called Marcus and sent him the security footage. That's criminal destruction of property, Marcus said. Press charges. I will. But first, I'm installing a better gate. The new gate went up 2 days later. This one was reinforced steel with a lock that would require an angle grinder to cut through. I also installed additional cameras, motion sensor lights, and new signs every 50 feet. Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. The HOA residents were furious. My email inbox filled with angry messages. Someone left a bag of garbage at my gate. My mailbox was knocked over twice in 1 week. I ignored all of it and focused on research. I wanted to understand Riverside Commons' finances. If I was going to fight them, I needed to know what leverage they actually had and what leverage I had over them. The HOA's financial documents were public record, filed with the county as part of their bond obligation. I requested copies and spent a weekend going through them. That's when I found it. Riverside Commons had financed their infrastructure, roads, sewers, streetlights, clubhouse, pool, with an $8 million municipal bond issued 6 years ago. The HOA was responsible for making monthly payments of $45,000. The bond had 18 years remaining. If the HOA defaulted on those payments, the bondholders could force liquidation of the HOA's assets. But more immediately, if property values in Riverside Commons dropped significantly, the HOA's bond rating would be downgraded. It's triggering penalty clauses that could accelerate the debt. And what would cause property values to drop? Being landlocked. If I gated Commons Drive and blocked access to all 65 homes, property values would collapse overnight. No one would buy a home they couldn't reach. Appraisers wouldn't value properties without legal access. Mortgage companies would consider it a material change in property conditions. Richard's lawsuit wasn't about my driveway shortcut anymore. It wasn't even really about the 200-foot section of Commons Drive. It was about preventing the financial collapse of the entire HOA. I owned the choke point to 65 homes and $8 million in bond debt. I drafted a letter and had Marcus review it before sending. To the Riverside Commons HOA Board. You have 48 hours to drop your lawsuit and remove all fines and liens against my property. If you do not, I will install a gate across Commons Drive at the point where it crosses my property. Your neighborhood will be landlocked until we reach an agreement. You have been using my property without permission or payment for 5 years. That ends now. Marcus sent it via email and certified mail. Richard called an emergency board meeting that night. I know because one of the board members, a woman named Jennifer who'd never been part of Richard's confrontations, called me. Our attorney reviewed the survey, she said. You really own that section of road. I really do. And there's no easement? None recorded. Your developer never formalized the agreement. Richard is telling everyone you're bluffing, that you won't actually gate the main road because it would be cruel to 65 families. I offered to negotiate. He cut my lock with bolt cutters at 1:30 in the morning. She was quiet for a moment. 48 hours? 48 hours. I didn't hear anything for 2 days. The deadline passed at 5 p.m. on a Thursday. At 8 a.m. Friday morning, a construction crew arrived at my property with a truck full of materials, steel posts, fencing panels, concrete, and a large gate assembly. I met them at the section of Commons Drive that crossed my land. Richard's car screeched to a stop 20 minutes later. He got out and walked toward me, his face red. You can't do this, he said. I gave you a chance, I said. The construction crew started digging post holes. The construction crew finished installing the second gate by noon. On it stood across Commons Drive exactly where the road crossed my property, 200 feet from the Riverside Commons entrance. Heavy steel, 8 feet tall, with a commercial-grade lock and a sign that read, Private Property, No Trespassing. All 65 homes in Riverside Commons were now behind a locked gate on my property. Richard stood on the other side, his hands gripping the bars. You can't do this. I offered to negotiate, I said. You cut my lock with bolt cutters at 1:30 in the morning and posted about it on Facebook. We'll sue you for every dollar you have. You're already suing me. This doesn't change anything except now you understand what I actually own. I walked back to my truck and drove home. My phone started ringing before I even reached my driveway. The crisis hit immediately. And parents couldn't get their kids to school. Commuters couldn't get to work. A delivery truck showed up at the gate with furniture for one of the homes and had to turn around. The school district sent a bus, took one look at the locked gate, and left. By 2 p.m., Richard had called the police. I was sitting on my porch when the sheriff's deputy arrived. He was the same deputy who'd responded when Richard showed up with bolt cutters at my first gate. Got a call about a landlocked neighborhood, he said. It's my property, I said. I have a survey showing the road crosses my land. There's no recorded easement. He looked at the survey I handed him, then at the property records on his tablet. After 10 minutes, he shook his head. It's your land. On it, you can gate it. But 65 families can't access their homes. Richard had followed the deputy to my property. This is illegal. It's a civil property dispute, the deputy said. I can't force a property owner to allow access across private land. You need to work this out in court or come to an agreement. Richard's face went pale. People need to get to work. Kids need to get to school. Then I suggest you work something out, the deputy said, and drove away. That evening, every single homeowner in Riverside Commons showed up at an emergency HOA meeting. I know because Jennifer, the board member who'd called me 2 days earlier, sent me a text. All 65 homes represented. It's chaos. She called me an hour later. Richard is telling everyone we're going to sue for immediate access and win in court, she said. How long will that take? Months, probably. Maybe a year if it goes to trial. People are panicking. Some have jobs they can't miss. One couple has a baby due in 3 weeks. They're terrified they won't be able to get to the hospital. I offered a temporary solution. Daily access from 6 to 9 a.m. and 5 to 8 p.m. That covers commutes and emergencies. Richard rejected it. He says we need 24/7 access. Then he needs to pay for an easement. He's refusing. He keeps saying we're not paying you a single cent. She paused. Some of us want to negotiate, but Richard still controls the board. Then you need a new board. She hung up. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with an email from Richard. Your blockade of Commons Drive is an illegal restraint of trade and a violation of our residents' civil rights. Harn, we are pursuing criminal charges in addition to our civil lawsuit. Remove the gate immediately. I forwarded it to Marcus. He called me back laughing. Criminal charges? For what? It's your property. He has no case. What about their civil suit? I'm filing our response tomorrow. We'll argue they have no right to use your land without compensation. But courts can be unpredictable, especially when you're dealing with 65 families. We need to be prepared for them to get sympathetic media coverage. He was right. The story hit the local news 2 days later. 65 homes landlocked after property dispute. The reporter interviewed Richard in front of the gate. He looked exhausted and desperate. This man is holding our families hostage, Richard said, gesturing at the locked gate. We have children who can't get to school. How are people who can't get to work? A pregnant woman who's terrified she won't be able to reach the hospital when she goes into labor? All because he wants to extort money from us. The reporter called me for comment. I kept it simple. I offered to negotiate. The HOA president cut my gate lock in the middle of the night and chose litigation instead. I own the property. I'm protecting my rights. The story painted me as unreasonable. One property owner versus 65 families. The comments section filled with angry messages calling me everything from greedy to sociopathic. I ignored all of it and kept researching. The HOA had hired their own surveyor to find alternative access routes. Their report came back a week later. I obtained a copy through Marcus during discovery. The report was devastating for them. There were no viable alternatives. When one route crossed protected wetlands, building a road there would be illegal and require years of environmental permits. Another route crossed county-owned land. The county had already denied the request. A third route crossed property owned by a rancher who'd refused to sell at any price. The only practical access to Riverside Commons was across my 200 feet. The financial pressure was mounting too. The HOA's bond payment was due in 3 weeks, $45,000. Jennifer sent me a text. Financial advisor says if we're landlocked much longer, property values will drop enough to trigger default clauses. We're running out of time. Then Marcus found something in the original HOA formation documents. This is interesting, he said over the phone. When Horizon Properties sold homes in Riverside Commons, they showed buyers an access easement agreement in the sales materials. The document said the development had permanent legal access via Commons Drive. But no easement was recorded, I said. Exactly. They sold homes claiming an easement existed when it didn't. That's fraud. Your buyers paid premium prices for homes they thought had guaranteed access, but the developer never formalized the legal paperwork. Within days, 3 homeowners filed a lawsuit against Horizon Properties for fraud. The company was bankrupt and defunct, but they also named Richard and the HOA board, claiming the board should have verified the easement before they bought their homes. One plaintiff was quoted in the legal filing. We paid $450,000 for a home we believed had permanent legal access, yet we were defrauded. Richard was now facing lawsuits from multiple directions, from me, from his own homeowners, and potentially from the bondholders if the HOA defaulted. He tried everything. He contacted the county and argued Commons Drive should be declared a public right-of-way since it served 65 homes. The county reviewed the records and denied the request. This is private property. The county has no claim. He went to the city council and lobbied for them to use eminent domain to take my property for public use. The city attorney shut it down immediately. Eminent domain requires a public necessity. This is a private HOA dispute. The city won't intervene. The HOA board started fracturing. Jennifer and 2 other members wanted to negotiate with me. Richard refused. We're not rewarding extortion, he said at a board meeting. It's not extortion if he owns the road, Jennifer argued. They held a vote to remove Richard as president. It failed 3-2. Richard still had control, barely. I spent the next week digging deeper into the HOA's finances, specifically the bond structure. If they defaulted, what actually happened? The answer was worse than I thought. If the HOA defaulted on the municipal bonds, the bondholders could force the sale of all HOA-owned common property. The clubhouse, pool, tennis courts, and even the internal streets that the HOA did own. It would effectively dissolve the entire HOA and leave the homeowners without any community infrastructure. Who holds the bonds? I asked Marcus. Let me check. I heard him typing. They were issued by the county but sold to investors. It looks like they're currently held by a municipal investment fund managed by Cascade Holdings. I went completely still. Say that again. Cascade Holdings. It's an investment firm that specializes in municipal bonds and HOA debt. I'd heard that name before. I called my uncle, my mother's brother, who managed our family trust. Quick question, I said. Does our family have any connection to a company called Cascade Holdings? Cascade Holdings? That's one of ours. We use it for fixed income investments. Why? Do we own bonds on something called Riverside Commons HOA? I heard him typing on his keyboard. Yes, $8 million in municipal bonds. Purchased 4 years ago. They're current on payments. Barely. Why are you asking? I looked at the gate across Commons Drive, and at the locked entrance to 65 homes whose HOA was 3 weeks away from default. Because I own their only access road, I said, and they're about to stop making your payments. 3 weeks after I installed the gate, the HOA missed their bond payment. I found out from my uncle before anyone else did. He called me on a Tuesday morning. Riverside Commons didn't make their payment yesterday. $45,000. The trustee is sending a default notice today. What happens now? If they don't cure the default within 30 days, we can accelerate the entire debt. $8 million becomes due immediately. They obviously can't pay that, so we'd foreclose on all their common property, clubhouse, pool, everything the HOA owns. How fast could that happen? 90 days, maybe less. Why? What? You sound like you're planning something. Just thinking, I said. I called Marcus. The HOA just defaulted on their bonds. My family's company holds the debt. Can I use that as leverage? Absolutely. If they won't negotiate access across your land, you can threaten to call the entire bond debt. They'd lose everything. I drafted an email to the HOA board and sent it that afternoon. I've learned that Riverside Commons has defaulted on its municipal bond payments. I've also learned that my family trust, through Cascade Holdings, owns those bonds. If you continue to refuse reasonable negotiation on the access easement, I will instruct Cascade Holdings to accelerate the entire $8 million debt. You will lose your clubhouse, pool, and all common property. Will you have 48 hours to contact me to discuss settlement terms? Jennifer called me within an hour. Is this real? Your family owns our bonds? Yes. And you can really call the entire debt? Yes, but I don't want to. I want the same thing I've always wanted, a fair easement agreement and to be left alone. Richard is saying this is a conspiracy, that you planned this whole thing. I bought my property 2 years ago. Riverside Commons was built 5 years ago. Your developer failed to record an easement. Your HOA president started this fight 3 months ago when he showed up at my gate with bolt cutters. I offered reasonable terms. He cut my lock in the middle of the night and sued me. None of this was planned. It's just facts and consequences. She was quiet for a moment. Some of us are looking into Richard's background. Maybe we're finding some things that don't add up. Like what? He owns 4 rental properties in Riverside Commons. 4. He's not just a homeowner, he's an investor. High property values matter to him financially, not just personally. So his refusal to negotiate isn't about principle. No, it's about his investment portfolio. She paused. We're calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow night. I think we finally have the votes to remove him. The meeting happened at 7 p.m. I wasn't there, but Jennifer called me at 8:30. He's out, she said. We voted 4-1 to remove Richard as president. I'm interim president now. How did he take it? He threatened to sue us. Said we were acting illegally, that we'd regret this. All the usual threats. But he's done. He has no authority anymore. What happens now? Now we negotiate. Can you meet tomorrow? We met at my property the next afternoon. Jennifer brought 2 other board members, Tom and Sarah, and the HOA's attorney, a woman named Patricia. Jennifer got straight to the point. What do you want? The same terms I offered Richard weeks ago. You pay fair market value for a permanent easement across the 200-foot section of Commons Drive that crosses my land. You drop all lawsuits and remove all liens against my property. You pay my legal fees. I remove the gate on Commons Drive. I keep my driveway gate, no HOA access to my property. And if you violate the terms, the easement revokes automatically. How much? Tom asked. $150,000 for the easement, $25,000 for my legal fees. A total of $175,000. Patricia pulled out a calculator. That's about $2,700 per home. Some of our homeowners can't afford that, Sarah said. We're already in financial trouble. Then take out a loan, I said. Secure it against your clubhouse or pool. But this is the deal. Take it or I call the bond debt and you lose everything anyway. Jennifer looked at the other board members. They both nodded. We'll take it to the homeowners, Jennifer said. We need 75% approval for a special assessment this size. The vote was scheduled for the following week. Jennifer called a mandatory HOA meeting. Every homeowner was required to attend or submit a proxy vote. Richard showed up. He wasn't on the board anymore, but he was still a homeowner with 4 votes. He stood up during the open comment period. Don't let him win. This man has held us hostage for weeks. If we pay him, we're setting a dangerous precedent. We should fight this in court. Win what? A homeowner shouted back. Our homes are landlocked. My kids missed 2 weeks of school. This is about principle, Richard said. We can't reward extortion. It's not extortion if he owns the road, another homeowner yelled. The developer lied to us. We're paying for their fraud, not his greed. With what money? Someone else added. We're already in default. If we don't settle, we lose everything. Jennifer called for order. We've reviewed every alternative. There is no other access. There is no winning in court. He owns the property. Our only options are settle now or wait for the bondholders to foreclose. I'm calling the vote. 52 homeowners voted yes. 13 voted no. 80% approval. The easement was approved. Richard stood up, his face red. Yash, you've betrayed this community. All of you. When this backfires, don't come crying to me. He walked out. The HOA had to scramble to raise the money. Most homeowners paid the $2,700 assessment within a week, but several couldn't afford it. The HOA took out an emergency loan secured by the clubhouse to cover the shortfall and make the immediate payment. 2 weeks after the vote, I met Jennifer at the gate on Commons Drive. She handed me a cashier's check for $175,000. It's done. I'll have Marcus draw up the easement documents. Once they're recorded with the county, I'll remove the gate. What about your driveway? My driveway gate stays. No HOA residents are allowed on my property. The easement covers Commons Drive only. She nodded. That's fair. The easement was recorded 3 days later, and I hired the same construction crew to remove the gate. By that afternoon, Commons Drive was open again. I installed signs along the easement section. Easement area, no stopping, no parking, 25 miles per hour, maximum speed. The crisis was over. The HOA resumed their bond payments. Home values stabilized, access was restored. But Richard refused to pay his share of the assessment. He owned 4 properties, which meant he owed $10,800. He sent an email to the HOA board. I voted against this corrupt deal. I'm not paying a cent for it. Sue me if you want. The HOA filed liens against all 4 of his properties. Richard responded by suing the HOA board for breach of fiduciary duty, claiming they'd acted against the homeowner's best interest by settling with me. During discovery for that lawsuit, Marcus found something. But you need to see this, he said, forwarding me a document. Richard's phone records. We subpoenaed them as part of his lawsuit against the board. I opened the file. It showed a series of calls between Richard and a number listed as Sunrise Development Corp. Who's Sunrise Development? I asked. A developer that builds subdivisions. I called them. They confirmed Richard approached them 2 months ago, right in the middle of your gate dispute. He wanted them to buy your property to create a second access road for Riverside Commons. He was trying to get me to sell? More than that, look at this email. Marcus sent another file. It was from Richard to a representative at Sunrise Development, dated 6 weeks earlier, before the board removed him as president. I'll keep dragging out the dispute. He's already frustrated. Well, another month of being locked in litigation and he'll want out. Make him a lowball offer. $300,000. He'll cave. When you close, my finder's fee is $50,000 as discussed. I read it 3 times. Richard had been sabotaging settlement negotiations deliberately. He'd refused to compromise with me not because of principle, but because he had a deal with a developer. If he could make me miserable enough to sell, he'd get $50,000. Who sent you this? I asked Marcus. It came anonymously. Someone sent it to the HOA board, too. Jennifer called me an hour later. We received a package, printed emails between Richard and Sunrise Development. He was trying to profit off our crisis. I saw them. He sold us out. He dragged out negotiations, refused reasonable settlement terms, let us go into bond default. Also, a developer would buy your property and he'd get $50,000. Her voice was shaking with anger. How many homeowners suffered because of his greed? What are you going to do? We're suing him. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, everything Marcus can think of. He put his personal profit ahead of 65 families. He's done. The anonymous package arrived at the HOA's management office on a Tuesday morning. Inside were 40 pages of printed emails between Richard and Sunrise Development Corporation, along with phone records and text messages spanning 2 months. Jennifer called me as soon as she read them. You need to see these. Richard wasn't just refusing to negotiate with you. He was actively trying to sabotage any settlement so the developer could buy your property. Marcus obtained copies through discovery. The email chain told the whole story. Richard had contacted Sunrise Development 6 weeks into our dispute. Right around the time he'd rejected my first offer to discuss an easement, he'd pitched them on buying my property to create a second access road for Riverside Commons. The developer was interested but worried I'd never sell at a price that made financial sense for their project. Richard's response was in writing. I'll keep the conflict going. He'll want out eventually. Another month of litigation and being locked in a gate war, he'll be desperate. Make him a lowball offer, $300,000. He'll cave. The developer had agreed. Now their response email confirmed, if we acquire the property, your finder's fee is $50,000 as discussed. Every time I'd offered to negotiate, Richard had rejected it, not because the terms were unreasonable, but because he needed me desperate enough to sell cheap. The longer the conflict dragged on, the more likely I was to give up. He'd even encouraged the HOA to file their lawsuit, knowing it would drain my resources and patience. He'd sacrificed the HOA's financial stability, endangered 65 families' access to their homes, and pushed the community into bond default, all for a $50,000 payday. The HOA filed suit against Richard 3 days later. Breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, conflict of interest, and damages from unnecessary legal fees in the bond default. They were seeking $200,000 in damages. Richard's attorney tried to spin it as a misunderstanding. My client was exploring alternative solutions to the access problem. The developer contacted him, not the other way around. He was trying to help the community by finding additional access options. Marcus subpoenaed the developer's representative for a deposition. The man, a vice president at Sunrise Development named David Torres, appeared 2 weeks later and systematically destroyed Richard's defense. Mr. Chen contacted us, Torres testified. He called our office and said he had an opportunity for us. He explained that a property owner was blocking access to Riverside Commons and that the owner would eventually want to sell. He promised he could deliver the property within 6 months. Did Mr. Chen say how he would accomplish that? Marcus asked. Yes. He said he would make the current owner want to sell. He told us he was the HOA president and could use that position to create pressure through fines, lawsuits, and legal costs. He said, quote, I'll make it expensive enough that he'll want out. And what was your company's role? We were supposed to make a purchase offer once Mr. Chen confirmed the owner was ready to sell. The offer was to be well below market value, $300,000 for property worth at least $500,000. And what was Mr. Chen's compensation for this? $50,000 as a finder's fee. Then Tom, one of the board members who'd voted to remove Richard as president, came forward with a recording. Richard had invited several homeowners to his house 3 weeks into the gate dispute to discuss strategy. Tom had been uncomfortable with Richard's aggressive approach and had started recording the meeting on his phone. In the recording, Richard's voice was clear. I'm not settling with him. I have a better deal lined up. Once he's desperate enough, the developer will buy him out cheap. I get paid either way. Either he sells or we win in court, and I look like a hero. But selling is better for me financially. Someone on the recording asked, what about the bond payment? We're going to miss it if this drags on. Richard's response, we'll make it eventually. A few weeks of missed payments won't kill us. But if we settle now, I get nothing. We need to stay strong. Marcus played the recording in court during the trial. And the judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Morrison, who'd been hearing property cases for 20 years, looked disgusted. "Mr. Chen," she said, setting down the transcript of the recording, "you were the HOA president. You had a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the community. Instead, you deliberately prolonged a dispute that caused significant financial harm to the HOA because you stood to personally profit from the property owner's desperation. You put your financial interest ahead of 65 families." Richard's attorney tried to object. "Your Honor, my client's intentions—" "I've heard enough," Judge Morrison said. "Mr. Chen's own words, recorded at his own home, make his intentions crystal clear. He was not exploring solutions. He was creating problems to engineer a profitable outcome for himself." She signed the judgment. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $175,000. The exact amount the HOA had to pay for an easement that should have been negotiated months earlier. Mr. Chen will also pay the $10,800 in easement assessments he's refused to pay for his 4 properties. He is removed from the HOA board permanently and banned from holding any HOA position for the next 10 years. Richard's face went pale. His attorney started to speak, but Richard just stood up and walked out of the courtroom. Within 3 months, he was forced to sell 2 of his 4 rental properties in Riverside Commons to pay the judgment. The properties sold below market value in a rush sale. If the other 2 properties still had HOA liens on them for unpaid assessments, clouding their titles and making them difficult to refinance. His total losses exceeded $200,000 between the judgment, legal fees, and forced property sales at depressed prices. He filed for bankruptcy 6 months after the judgment. The State Real Estate Board opened an investigation after reviewing the fraud case and suspended his license indefinitely. A year after the trial, he moved out of Riverside Commons entirely. I heard from Jennifer that he'd relocated 2 states away. The HOA also sued Sunrise Development for conspiracy. The developer's attorneys called Jennifer within a week. "We'll settle for $100,000 to avoid the publicity of a trial." Jennifer accepted. She used the money to pay down the emergency loan they'd taken to fund the easement payment. Jennifer ran the HOA the way it should have been run from the beginning. She published detailed financial reports every month showing exactly where every dollar went. She solicited competitive bids for all vendor contracts instead of awarding them to friends. She held regular meetings where homeowners could voice concerns without being shouted down. The drama disappeared. The finances stabilized. Life went back to normal. I drive down Commons Drive occasionally, across the easement section on my property, and see neighbors working in their yards or kids playing in the street. Some would wave. A few still glared, holding on to resentment about the $2,700 assessment or about having to pay for access to their own neighborhood in, as they put it. One afternoon, about 6 months after the settlement, a homeowner I didn't recognize stopped his car near where I was checking the easement boundary markers. "You're the property owner, right?" he asked, rolling down his window. "Yes. I wanted to say thank you for being reasonable in the end. I know Richard made everything difficult, and you could have dragged it out longer. My family appreciates that you eventually worked with us." "I was reasonable from the start," I said. "Your president wasn't." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, we know that now. Most of us anyway." A year after the settlement, Richard tried one more time. He filed a lawsuit against me personally, claiming I had conspired to defraud the HOA by allegedly working with my family's investment company to create the access crisis deliberately. The complaint was barely coherent. It cited no actual evidence, just speculation and accusations that I'd manipulated the situation. Marcus filed a motion to dismiss. The judge granted it at the first hearing and went further. She sanctioned Richard for filing a frivolous lawsuit and ordered him to pay my legal fees. $15,000. That was the last I heard from Richard. 2 years after I'd first installed the gate on Commons Drive, I was sitting on my porch on a Saturday afternoon when a car pulled up at my driveway gate, the gate I'd kept for my own privacy. A woman got out. I didn't recognize her. I walked down to the gate. "Can I help you?" "Hi," she said, smiling. "I'm Amanda Chen. I'm the new HOA president." I wanted to introduce myself. I tensed. What do you want? Nothing. I just wanted to thank you for being patient with us during, everything. I know Richard made things very difficult. We really appreciate the easement and your willingness to work with us once he was out of the picture. I relaxed slightly. It's fine. Welcome to the neighborhood. Thank you. She paused. Actually, I wanted to ask, would you consider joining the HOA board? We're always looking for people who understand property law, and you clearly know your rights. We could use that perspective. I laughed. Not a chance. She smiled. I figured as much, but I had to ask. Well, if you ever need anything or have any issues with traffic on the easement, just let me know. We want to be good neighbors. I appreciate that. She drove away. I walked back to my porch, sat down, and looked out at my 3 acres of wooded privacy. My driveway gate was still locked. My property was still mine. On no HOA meetings, no architectural reviews, no drama, and Riverside Commons had learned that property rights aren't negotiable just because you have a majority vote. 3 years after the easement agreement was signed, the relationship between me and Riverside Commons had normalized completely. The section of Commons Drive that crossed my property was well maintained by the HOA. Freshly paved, clean, no littering. Residents drove the speed limit. No one parked on the easement. The signs I'd posted were respected. I kept my driveway gate. That had always been the point. Privacy, security, control over my own property. But the gate wasn't a symbol of conflict anymore. It was just what it should have been from the beginning, a boundary marker. Jennifer had served as HOA president for 2 years after Richard was removed, and then stepped down to spend more time with her family. The new president was a retired engineer named Marcus, who ran the HOA the way Richard should have, efficiently, transparently, and without drama. He published financial reports every quarter. He negotiated competitive contracts for maintenance and services. He listened to homeowners instead of dictating to them. The emergency loan the HOA had taken to pay for the easement was paid off 18 months after the settlement. Marcus immediately lowered the monthly dues from $350 to $275. The savings showed up in every homeowner's budget, a small but tangible benefit of competent leadership. Home values in Riverside Commons had recovered and then climbed higher than they'd been before the dispute. I found this ironic at first. How could a neighborhood that had been landlocked and embroiled in legal conflict end up more valuable? But Marcus explained it one afternoon when we ran into each other at the hardware store. The dispute forced us to clean house, he said. We got rid of corrupt leadership, reformed our finances, and started operating transparently. Buyers see that now. They see an HOA that functions properly instead of one run by someone like Richard. Property values are up 18% from where they were 3 years ago. Richard was still living 2 towns away, as far as I knew. He'd lost his real estate license permanently after the state board reviewed the fraud judgment. I heard from Jennifer that he was working in sales at a furniture store. Occasionally, someone would send me a screenshot of his social media posts. Bitter rants about the corrupt property owner who held an entire neighborhood hostage, or how the legal system rewards greed over community. No one engaged with his posts anymore. He was shouting into a void. I never joined the HOA, but I'd occasionally attend their events as a guest. They had summer barbecues at the clubhouse, holiday parties, community yard sales. I was friendly with several homeowners now. They'd ask me for advice on property issues or boundary disputes, and I'd help when I could. But I never crossed the line into formal membership. I liked my independence too much. Marcus and I had lunch once, about a year after the settlement. We'd become something like friends, not close, but respectful. He told me his theory about what had gone wrong with Richard. He thought power meant forcing compliance, Marcus said. He'd been a city councilman, so he was used to voting on things and having his way. He didn't understand that property rights don't care about votes or majority rule. Real leadership is finding solutions that work for everyone, not forcing your will on people. I just wanted to be left alone, I said. He made it a war. He did, and he lost everything because of it. I'd started researching access disputes after everything settled, curious about how common these situations were. The answer, very common. Hundreds of cases nationwide where property owners found themselves adjacent to landlocked neighbors or developments. Usually they were resolved through negotiation and reasonable easement agreements. Only rarely did they escalate the way mine had. The difference I realized, too, was ego. When property owners and HOAs approach these situations pragmatically, as business transactions requiring mutual agreement, they got resolved quickly. When ego got involved, when someone decided it was about winning rather than solving a problem, everything spiraled. I wrote about my experience on a property rights blog. The post was titled "How to Handle HOA Disputes, a Case Study." I laid out everything that had happened, the mistakes Richard had made, and what I'd learned. The key advice I gave was simple. Document everything, know your property boundaries precisely, hire a good attorney early, and never negotiate from emotion. The post got shared widely. I received messages from dozens of people facing similar situations, HOAs claiming authority over properties that were never properly included in covenants, with developers who'd failed to record easements, neighbors demanding access they'd never legally obtained. Some of them thanked me for giving them the courage to stand up for their rights. Others asked specific questions about surveys, legal tactics, and negotiation strategies. I answered what I could and referred the rest to Marcus Webb, who'd become something of an expert in HOA property disputes after our case. 6 months ago, I ran into Richard at the hardware store. I was in the electrical aisle looking for replacement bulbs when I turned the corner and nearly walked into him. Our eyes met. He looked older, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he looked away and walked quickly toward the exit. I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no vindication. It was just two people who used to be in conflict and now weren't. It was over. My driveway gate stayed up, but I'd started leaving it open during the day sometimes. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The relationship with my neighbors was friendly enough now that I didn't feel the need to keep the gate closed as a defensive barrier. At night, I still locked it. That was about security, not conflict. It was exactly what I'd wanted from the beginning. Control over my own property, the ability to choose when to be accessible and when to have privacy. The easement on Commons Drive didn't change that. Cars still crossed my property every day, but they did it on my terms, with legal documentation and with proper compensation. I'd done the math once, calculating the real cost of the dispute. I'd received $150,000 for the easement plus $25,000 in legal fees. I'd spent roughly $30,000 of my own money on attorneys, surveys, and the gates I'd installed and then removed. Net profit, $145,000. More valuable than the money was what I'd established. My property boundaries were now precisely documented and recorded with the county. The HOA and all its residents knew exactly where my property began and ended. No one would ever again assume they had rights to my land. Worth it, I thought. About a year after the settlement, a representative from Sunrise Development, the company that had conspired with Richard, showed up at my gate. Different person this time, a senior vice president who introduced himself and tried to make small talk before getting to the point. "We're still interested in your property," he said. We'd like to create a second access point for Riverside Commons. We're prepared to offer $400,000. Not interested. We could go to $500,000. Cash offer, quick close. I like where I live. Leave me alone." He handed me his business card. "If you change your mind..." I tore the card in half and handed it back to him. He left. A neighbor, a woman named Sarah who lived 3 houses into Riverside Commons, stopped by a few weeks after that. She'd seen the developer's car at my gate and was curious. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Why didn't you just sell? The developer offered you good money, right? You could have avoided all of this." "Because this is my home," I said. "Why should I leave because your HOA made mistakes? Then why should I give up my property because your developer defrauded you and your president tried to extort me?" She thought about that. "Fair point. Your HOA spent 2 years trying to force me to give them free access to my land. When I refused, they tried to make my life miserable. When that didn't work, your president conspired to manipulate me into selling cheap. At no point did anyone simply knock on my door and say, 'We have a problem. Can we work together to solve it?' That's all I ever wanted. Respect for my property rights and fair compensation." She nodded. "I get it now. Most of us do. Richard made everything worse. That was the truth I'd come to understand. Most of the homeowners in Riverside Commons weren't bad people. They'd been led by bad leadership. Once Richard was removed and Jennifer, then Marcus, took over, everything improved. The system had worked, eventually. It just took longer and cost more than it should have. I was sitting on my porch last week, evening, watching the sun go down through the trees. Traffic from the easement section of Commons Drive was barely noticeable. A car every few minutes, headlights briefly visible through the woods. Birds were settling in for the night. The air was cool and quiet. Everything I'd wanted when I bought this property 3 years ago. Peace, privacy, woods, no HOA meetings, no architectural review boards. Just my 3 acres and the ability to live on my own terms. The gate stood at the end of my driveway, open at the moment, ready to close when I wanted it closed. My choice, my property, my control. Marcus drove by on Commons Drive, heading home from somewhere. He saw me on the porch and waved. I waved back. He continued on and his car disappeared around the bend. I went back to my book. No drama, no conflict. Just neighbors coexisting, each respecting the other's boundaries and rights, exactly as it should be.